The house sat on a hillside above Bel Air, and on the night of November 14th, 1997, it held 43 people. Not 40, not 50, 43. The kind of number that gets remembered because someone afterward felt compelled to count. The host was a producer whose name does not matter to this story. What matters is the house, 3 floors of travertine and glass, a terrace that looks south over the city lights, and a living room large enough to hold a confrontation that would be talked about in gyms and green rooms and late night conversations for the next quarter century. Steven Seagal arrived at 9:41 in the evening. He came through the front door without knocking, the way men arrive at parties when they believe the party has been waiting for them. He wore black. He always wore black. He was 45 years old, 6 feet 4 inches tall, and 230 pounds distributed across a frame that had spent 2 decades learning Aikido at a level most practitioners never approach. He was not a pretender. That is the first thing to understand about what happened that night. Seagal was genuinely dangerous. He had trained in Japan, had been awarded a 7th degree black belt, had opened his own dojo in Osaka at a time when Western men did not do such things in Japan and walk away with their credibility intact. His films had earned $400 million in domestic grosses across the previous decade. He had consulted with law enforcement, with federal agencies, with men who understood violence not as a concept, but as a fact. He entered that living room the way he entered every room, with the settled certainty of a man who believed no one present could touch him. He would be wrong. But he did not know that yet. Claude Van Damme arrived 11 minutes later. He was 37 years old that night, 5 feet 11, 192 pounds, stripped of any water weight because he was always stripped of water weight, always monitoring the machine of his body with the precision of a man who had started training at 10 years old in St. Lambrecht's Woluwe, Belgium, under Claude Goossens, and had not stopped since. He held a black belt in Shotokan karate. He had competed at the professional level in full contact kickboxing and had earned a record of 18 wins against 1 loss before he ever set foot inside a film studio. His splits were not a party trick. They were the residue of 17 years of deliberate practice. He walked into that living room in a white shirt with the top 2 buttons open, and almost no one looked up. That is the particular detail that makes what came next possible. Nobody in that room understood what they were looking at when they looked at Van Damme. Not yet. In the next 47 seconds, everything in that room would change. 43 people would stop their conversation simultaneously. Glasses would stop halfway to mouths. A woman near the fireplace would take 1 step backward without deciding to. And Steven Seagal, who had spent 3 decades believing himself to be the most dangerous man in any room he entered, would be made to confront a very specific kind of silence. Stay until the end of this story, because what Van Damme said quietly before he walked away would be repeated in martial arts circles for the next 25 years. And what Seagal did in the 4 weeks that followed tells you everything you need to know about both men. Nobody in that house knew they were about to witness something that does not happen twice in a generation. The party had been running for an hour and 40 minutes before Seagal moved to the center of the room. He did it the way he always did it, not loudly. Seagal understood that the loudest man in a room has already lost something. He moved to the center and he waited, and because he was Steven Seagal in 1997, the room reorganized itself around him. Conversations bent in his direction. Men with their own considerable accomplishments turned slightly on their heels to face him. This was the geometry of his life, and he was expert at it. He began talking about Aikido. The specific account of what he said that night has been reconstructed from 4 separate witnesses, 2 of whom spoke on record in the years that followed. The substance, as they each recalled it independently, was this: that Aikido was the only martial art that had kept pace with his own development. that other disciplines were incomplete, that practitioners of styles rooted in sport competition, in point systems, and the choreography of controlled sparring had developed bodies without the understanding that real confrontation required. He did not name anyone. He did not need to. Van Damme was in the room. Van Damme competed. The implication carried itself. What Seagal did next is the part that matters. He said, and multiple witnesses have verified the specific phrasing, that he could put any man in that room on the floor without that man understanding how it had happened. He said it the way a man says something he believes to be structurally true, not as a boast, but as an observation. He scanned the room as he said it. His eyes passed over Van Damme and moved on. Van Damme was standing near the east wall. There was a low table to his right with 2 bottles of sparkling water on it. He had a glass in his left hand, 3/4 full, and he was listening with the calm attention of a man who was deciding something privately. He set the glass down. The room did not notice him set the glass down. That is the specific detail that witnesses would return to afterward again and again, the way you return to the last ordinary moment before something changes. The glass went down without a sound, and Van Damme straightened, and he said, in a voice flat enough to be heard by the 8 people nearest to him and no one else, "You should be careful who you say that to." Seagal turned. Here is what you need to understand about that moment, and about every moment like it in the history of men who have trained seriously in violence. The turning is everything. It is the declaration. A man who turns to face a challenge has committed himself to the conversation that follows. Seagal turned, and in turning he acknowledged that the challenge existed, and in acknowledging it, he gave it weight. He looked at Van Damme across 11 feet of travertine floor. He said, "Is that right?" It was not a question. The people nearby understood it was not a question. Van Damme understood it was not a question. Van Damme nodded once, and then he did something that nobody in that room had seen done to Steven Seagal in any context, social or professional or otherwise. He walked toward him, not quickly, not aggressively. He crossed that 11 feet of floor the way a man crosses a room to examine something he finds interesting. His hands were loose at his sides. His shoulders were down. His breathing, as one witness standing close enough to observe, was even and slow. He stopped 4 feet from Seagal, and he looked at him with something that was not hostility and was not quite its opposite either. If you want to understand what happened in the next 47 seconds, you need to first understand what a fight is. A fight is not 2 men striking each other. That is a fight's result, not its nature. A fight is a negotiation about distance. Everything that happens inside a physical confrontation is a conversation about who controls the space between 2 bodies. The man who controls that distance controls the entire exchange. He decides when contact is possible. He decides when it is not. He decides the tempo, the angle, the moment of commitment. Every martial art, regardless of its origin or its tradition, is at its foundation a theory about distance management. Aikido says, receive the energy and redirect it. Kickboxing says, maintain the range where your weapons are longest. Karate says, enter once with precision and do not stay. Van Damme's entire competitive career had been built around one particular understanding of distance, the understanding that patience with the space between 2 bodies is worth more than aggression toward it. He stood 4 feet from Steven Seagal, and he did not close the distance further. He simply stood there and let the distance say what he could not say out loud in a room full of 43 people. Seagal understood. His jaw tightened by a fraction. He said, "You want to do this here." Van Damme said, "You offered." Later, when witnesses reconstructed the timeline, they established that 7 seconds had passed between Van Damme setting down his glass and Seagal's next response. 7 seconds in a room that had gone quiet enough to hear the city sounds coming through the glass on the south wall. Someone near the kitchen doorway had taken a step into the living room. The host himself had moved away from his own conversation toward the center of the room without, as he would later say, making any conscious decision to do so. Seagal said, "All right." He shifted his weight. It was a subtle movement, visible to trained eyes and invisible to everyone else, a redistribution of his body across his base that was the physical equivalent of a declaration. Seagal had decided he was no longer at a party, he was in a dojo. What happened next was seen by 41 of the 43 people present. If you are watching this and you have not subscribed yet, do it now. And leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. Because what came next in that room is the reason people are still talking about this night 27 years later. And you want to make sure you do not miss a second of it. Second one, Seagal moved first. He stepped forward with his left foot and extended his right hand in a lead hand extension that in Aikido functions as both a probe and a preparation, a reaching movement designed to establish contact with the opponent's energy, to find the line along which that energy is traveling, and to receive it. It was technically correct. It was exactly what his art asked of him in that moment. Seagal had thrown this movement 10,000 times. Van Damme slipped it, not parried it, not blocked it. He moved his head 4 inches to the left and dropped his right shoulder, and the extended hand passed through the space where his face had been and found nothing. One witness, a stunt coordinator with 20 years of set experience who was standing 6 feet to Van Damme's right, would say afterward that the slip was so economical that he almost missed it. Almost what he did not miss was Seagal's expression in the quarter second that followed, the particular recalibration of a man whose best technique has encountered genuine understanding. Second two, Seagal adjusted. This is the mark of a real practitioner, the instant accommodation of new information. He did not repeat the movement. He changed the angle, stepped across Van Damme's center line, and reached for the lapel. Aikido lives on the lapel. If Seagal had reached the lapel, the night would have taken a different shape. The technique he was entering was a Soto-gari modified through his years of training, a projection that begins with the lapel grip and ends with the opponent's back flat on the ground. He did not reach the lapel. Van Damme's left hand intercepted the wrist 4 inches before contact, not forcefully. The interception was quiet, almost conversational. A single firm placement of his palm against the inside of Seagal's wrist that stopped the reaching hand in place. The room heard nothing. The room saw it, the ones who were watching closely, because by now everyone was watching closely, but the room heard nothing. Because Van Damme had not used force, he had used position. The tournament director, who was standing near the east wall where Van Damme had been standing moments before, put his hands flat on the low table behind him. He would later describe this as an involuntary movement. Something in what he was watching required him to stabilize himself. Second three, Seagal pulled back and reset. The reset took 2 seconds of its own, a brief stillness in which both men regarded each other across a distance that had collapsed from 4 feet to 18 inches without anyone clearly choosing that collapse. 18 inches is a different country from 4 feet. At 4 feet, preparation is still possible. At 18 inches, preparation is over and the negotiation is entirely present tense. Seagal was breathing through his nose. Van Damme was not visibly breathing at all. A woman near the fireplace took 1 step backward. She did not decide to. Her body made the decision independently. Second four, Seagal went for the throw. Not a probe this time, not a reaching movement, but the full commitment of his considerable body weight and 2 decades of throwing men. A rotation of his hips that was designed to generate force across the lever of Van Damme's right arm. It was a technique that had ended most of his encounters in training. The men who knew what they were watching understood that this was Seagal's answer. His final argument, the thing he had trained longer than some people in the room, had been alive. Second five. Van Damme redirected the force, not resisted it, redirected it. This is the distinction that the serious practitioners in the room would discuss for years afterward. Van Damme accepted the rotation, moved inside it rather than against it, and shifted his base 90 degrees in a single step that placed him beside Seagal rather than in front of him. The direction of Seagal's force, which had been aimed at Van Damme's center line, now had nothing in front of it. The force traveled through empty space. Seagal stumbled forward by 2 steps before catching himself against the arm of a chair. The chair moved 4 inches across the travertine. The room did not make a sound. A man standing near the bar set his glass down on the counter. He did not put it down carefully. He simply stopped holding it. The glass hit the counter with a sound that was the only sound in the room for a full 3 seconds. Seagal straightened. He turned. His face had changed. Not broken, not collapsed, but changed. The way a landscape changes when the light shifts rather than when the ground moves. He looked at Van Damme, and Van Damme looked back at him, and the 11 feet that had separated them at the beginning had reasserted itself through the movement of those 47 seconds, and they were once again across the room from each other. Van Damme had not thrown a strike. He had not attempted a takedown. He had not raised his voice or his hands above the level of his shoulders. He had moved twice. 3 times if you count the slip. He had accepted 2 attempts and redirected 1. He had done this in front of 43 people in a room worth more than most buildings in most cities, in a white shirt with the top 2 buttons open, and his breathing at the end of those 47 seconds was the same as it had been at the beginning. He walked back to the east wall. The 8 people standing nearest to him moved very slightly to give him room, not out of fear, out of the specific recognition that some bodies command space differently than others, and it is appropriate to acknowledge it. He did not pick up his glass. He looked at Seagal, and across the room Seagal looked back, and Van Damme said something then, quietly enough that only 3 people heard the words themselves. The others saw the shape of the sentence, saw Seagal receive it and stand with it for a moment, saw Seagal's chin lower almost imperceptibly, a movement so small that the host, standing 7 feet away, initially took it for nothing. It was not nothing. The 3 witnesses who heard what Van Damme said have offered nearly identical accounts. What he said was this: "I know what you are. I have always known. Now you know that I know." Seagal stood with those words for 4 seconds. Then he nodded. Once, a different kind of nod than the one Van Damme had offered earlier. Van Damme's nod had been an acknowledgement of terms. Seagal's was something else. It was the nod of a man who has been handed a truth he cannot put down. The host, standing nearby, said afterward that he had never seen Seagal's face carry that particular expression before, and he had known Seagal for 11 years. Seagal left the party 14 minutes later. He said his goodbyes properly. He shook hands, spoke briefly with the host, made a remark about the view from the terrace that several witnesses remembered as entirely ordinary. He walked out through the same front door he had walked through at 9:41, and he did not look back across the room as he went. Van Damme stayed another hour and 20 minutes. He talked to people about Belgium. He talked about a film he was preparing. He talked about his daughter. The woman who had taken the involuntary step backward near the fireplace ended up standing beside him near the bar. And she would say later that he was the easiest person to talk to at the party, and that she did not put together until she drove home that the ease was the thing, that the same quality that had made him impossible to touch in the center of that room was the quality that made him entirely comfortable at a party afterward. The absence of a need to prove something is its own kind of calm. What happened in the weeks that followed is where the story becomes larger than a party. Word moved the way word moves in that world, sideways and quietly, person to person, through training halls and production offices, and the specific informal channels through which men who work in physical disciplines communicate about each other. The stunt coordinator told 2 people. The tournament director told 4 people. Each of those 6 told others, With the particular urgency that attaches to a story that feels historically significant, the urgency of a witness who understands that what they saw is not available on film, cannot be replayed, and will be carried only by the living memory of the people in that room. Within 10 days, the story had reached Japan. A journalist who covered martial arts for a publication in Osaka received 3 separate accounts from sources who had not spoken to each other. The accounts agreed on the timeline, agreed on the specific number of movements, agreed on the words spoken at the end. The journalist published nothing. He filed the accounts in a folder and kept the folder for 19 years. And when he finally wrote about that night in a retrospective on American martial arts culture published in 2016, he noted that the 3 independent accounts were, in his assessment, the most reliable documentation of a private confrontation he had encountered in 30 years of covering the subject. What Seagal did in the 4 weeks following the party is a matter of partial record. He trained. His longtime training partner, in an account given to a documentary crew in 2011, said that in the weeks following that November, Seagal changed something in the character of his training, that he began working on aspects of his footwork and his distance management that he had not emphasized in years. The training partner did not know what had prompted it. He did not know about the party. He said only that Seagal came to those sessions with an attention he had not seen in him for a long time. The attention of a man who has recently encountered something he does not yet understand and intends to understand it. This is the fork in the road that the story offers. There are 2 ways for a man to receive what Seagal received in that room. The first way is to use it, to take the information that has been handed to him, which is specific and actionable and genuinely useful, and to become better. The second way is to discard it, to decide that the encounter was anomalous, that the conditions were wrong, that the account does not apply to the man's understanding of himself. The fork matters because the direction a man chooses at that fork tells you more about him than the encounter itself. The training partner's account and the one other partial record from that period suggest that Seagal took the first road, chose to use it. That in the privacy of the dojo, away from the geometry of public reputation. He was honest with himself about what 47 seconds in a travertine room had shown him. Van Damme never told the story, not publicly, not in interviews, not in the accounts he gave to journalists who followed him through the production years that came after. Men who trained with him and who heard versions of the story through the informal channels, who asked him about it directly, received the same response, a brief silence, then a subject change, then a resumption of the conversation that had preceded the question as though the question had not been asked. This is its own kind of answer. The stunt coordinator, who had been standing 6 feet to Van Damme's right that night, and who had watched the slip in the first second with the trained eye of a man who had spent 2 decades understanding the mechanics of staged and unstaged violence, gave an account in 2019 to a podcast focused on martial arts history. He said, "I have been on set for 500 days across my career. I have watched people who knew what they were doing and people who believed they knew what they were doing, and I learned to tell the difference. What I watched in those 47 seconds was a man who knew, and what made it remarkable was not what he did, but what he did not do. He did not do everything he could have done, not by a long way. The pulled moment is the thing. The moment where the completion of the action would have been straightforward and the choice was made not to complete it. Van Damme, in redirecting Seagal's third attempt, had positioned himself in a way that gave him options, real options. The stunt coordinator and the tournament director both identified from their respective vantage points what those options were. Van Damme had not taken them. He had stepped back. He had let the movement complete itself in the only way it could, which was in Seagal's forward stumble against the chair, and then he had increased the distance, and he had stood still. The extended hand, the private sentence. These are the instruments of a man who has decided something about his purpose in a confrontation. They are the instruments of a teacher, not a combatant. Van Damme in that room made the choice that the best practitioners always make when the choice is available. He stopped short of what he could have done because what he could have done was not the point. The point was the information, passed clearly, absorbed honestly by both men, and then concluded. The host of the party, speaking in a 2020 interview about a different subject that nonetheless touched on that evening, said, "I have had a lot of people through that house, famous people, capable people. I have watched a lot of rooms. I do not think I have seen a room change the way that room changed in those 47 seconds. And I do not think I have seen it go back to ordinary as quickly afterward." Van Damme made it ordinary again. He walked back to the wall and everything just resumed. That is the part I have thought about most. Not what happened after what happened. This is the thing about a man who does not need the room to remember. The city lights were the same through the south-facing glass after as they had been before. Traffic continued on the boulevard below. The party went on for another 2 hours and reached its natural conclusion, and 43 people drove home through the November streets of Los Angeles, and most of them never spoke publicly about what they had seen. And the ones who did tell the story told it quietly, to people they trusted, as though they had been present at something sacred and had not yet decided how much of the sacred is transferable through language. It is not, mostly, this is the lesson. What happened in that room belongs to the people who were in it, and what has reached the rest of us is only the outline of the thing. The perimeter of an event whose center is held by 43 sets of private memory, most of which will go to the grave uncollected. What we have is this. A man who was genuinely dangerous walked into a room that held someone more dangerous. The more dangerous man was smaller and quieter and had not arrived expecting to demonstrate anything. He demonstrated it anyway because the invitation was issued in public, and the refusal of a public invitation is its own demonstration of a different and lesser kind. He did not destroy what he could have destroyed. He did not embarrass beyond what the moment required. He passed the information and he stepped back and he went on with his evening. 43 people drove home through the November streets of Bel Air. The thing a man learns in 17 years of training is not a technique. Techniques are available in books and in schools and in the patient instruction of teachers who can show you the angle of the elbow and the placement of the foot. What 17 years teaches you, if you are paying the right kind of attention, is the difference between what you are capable of and what the moment requires. The gap between those two things is not weakness. It is the entire content of wisdom in the physical domain. The man who can do everything and chooses correctly from within that everything is a different category of practitioner than the man who does everything he can, because the limits of his choice and the limits of his ability happen to coincide. Van Damme in that room demonstrated the gap. The gap is the lesson. The gap is what 43 people drove home with, without necessarily having the language for it. The gap is what the stunt coordinator meant when he said, it was not what he did, it was what he did not do. Know what you are capable of. Choose correctly from inside it. Let the choice do the talking that your capacity does not need to do. That is the sentence that November Room has been translating into language for 27 years. Next time we look at the night Muhammad Ali walked into a karate tournament in Chicago in 1975 and the exchange he had with the instructor that no one in that room was prepared for. The man who witnessed it from 6 feet away did not speak about it publicly for 31 years. When he finally did, he used only one sentence to describe what he saw, and that sentence has stayed with everyone who heard it since. That story is next.